So last week, we looked at a story in the Old Testament, Elijah with the widow. He was sent there for her to be able to provide a blessing for him and meals. Got there. She didn't know how she was going to feed her own family, was preparing to die. And so we looked at that and we drew some things out of that hopefully can help us. This morning, as we continue in this thought, we're going to look at another one of those Old Testament stories, very similar. This time it's the prophet Elisha, and again with a widow. And in this one, we're going to talk about preparing to be blessed. And last week was all about God calling somebody out of the midst of their despair and reminding them that He's always there, that He provides blessings, even when we don't realize that's what He's doing, that He works in those things and calls us back to Him in the midst of those struggles. This week, we're going to be looking at 2 Kings chapter 4. We're going to begin with verse 1 and just 7 short verses here for our story. It said, the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead. You know that he revered the Lord, but now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves. Elisha replied to her, how can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? Your servant has nothing there at all, she said, except a small jar of olive oil. Elisha said, go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. And then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons, and pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. And she left him and shut the door behind her and her sons, and they brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. And when all the jars were full, she said to her son, bring me another one, but he replied, there's not a jar left. Then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God. He said, go and sell the oil, pay your debts, and you and your sons can live off of what is left. So again, just as in the story last week, we see someone who is in a moment of despair. Both of these cases kind of deals with the despair of poverty. The despair of one didn't have enough food or anything left, was preparing to have one last meal with her son and then sit down to die. This one, her focus is not on quite that level of despair, but the fact that somebody's coming to take her sons as payment for debt. And so she's of the mindset, well, my husband has served God for all these years. Man of God, do something about this. And so, excuse me. I think as we look at these stories, they're here to remind us not only of what God can do in the case of food and these poverty moments. It's not just one of these things that some people would try to take and run and say, well, see, God will can make us just overflowing with money and health and all those things. He could, but that's not the moral behind these stories, not what's trying to be taught to us. But as we look at this, we want to begin thinking about what is it that we learn from these. And the first thing, I think, it can be summed up as this: seek God's help. And I know that sounds like what we know we all ought to do. It sounds like what every preacher in the world, what one of his first statements is seek God's help, or prayer, or some version of that. But the reality is that even as Christians, as much as we know that should be our first step, when the moments of trouble and the moments of despair come in our lives, for whatever the subject is that where we usually go first? A lot of times it's not. If it is, it's kind of in passing, um, in a going through the motions kind of way with prayer. Of okay, God, I've got this issue, and we just sort of casually take it to Him, and not really turn to Him and say, okay, what are you trying to do in this? What are you trying to accomplish? What ways, Father, can you work in the midst of this so that we can see your glory? The widow knew Elisha was a man of God, and so she reached out to him and said, this is how I'm going to approach God, how I'm going to reach God. Now, it was a very different time then for them. They had the prophets. They had the priest, and those were your avenues for approaching God. If you had a sin issue, you went to the priest, and they approached God for you to deal with that through sacrifices. If there was a known prophet in the area, you went to him because he was the one that was speaking directly to and hearing directly from God in that moment. And so that's what she does in this case. Today, we do have a much more direct avenue. You don't have to hunt me up to be able to go and take your problem before God. You can do that through your own prayers, through your own study of His Word, through your own efforts with Him, and evaluation to see where He's at. But that being said, there's still value in not just coming to a preacher, but to coming to fellow Christians. It is part of the purpose of the church is for us to be here to support one another, to help one another, encourage, to help in moments of despair, to find how God is going to bless us and work us through these moments, what those blessings might be. So the first thing is bring the problem to God immediately. Second thing that we learn out of these stories here, especially this one, is take stock of what you already have. Once she asked Elisha, hey, do something about this. What can you do about it? Or what can you get God to do about it? And Elisha's first question is, well, what do you want me to do about it? But his second question there is, what do you already have that we can use? Or that God can work with to further enable you in this situation. As she took stock of her whole thing, the only thing that she comes up with, I've got this one little jar of oil. To her, it probably didn't seem like near enough. To Elisha, that was all God needed. And so that's where he began, was with that. So many times when we have the problems start in our lives, when we have that begins to just so preoccupy our mind that we're stressing out over it, that we're feeling the anxiety, just really struggling with it. It gets to the point that it begins to block out everything else that God is doing in our lives. We're so focused on that we fail to see the other things around us, where God is already trying to say, hey, look, here's some of the blessings that I have for you. Here's some of the things that we can use to guide you through this, or to help you to overcome this moment. And so there has to be this moment where we stop and pause and say, I'm not going to allow this trouble, this moment of despair, to rule my life to the point that I'm blind to everything else that's going on in my life, to everything else that God is already doing. And sometimes the things that God is going to use are so seemingly small that they're so easy to overlook. And it's only when we look back that we begin to see them. Uh, Sometimes maybe they even appear to us to be one of the stressors that are involved in our problem. And I'm sure the woman was not looking at a small jar of oil and saying, that's a blessing. She's looking at it and thinking, that oil's about to run out. I'm going to have to, the money that I could be giving to the debtor, I'm going to have to use to go buy some more oil and some more flour and stuff to be able to continue to live. From the approach that she's looking at it, it most likely added more into the problem than it did as a solution to the problem. That happens when we begin to lose our focus, when we begin to stop choosing to see things as blessings from God and how to utilize them and begin focusing more on the problems. The third thing, and this is one of the ones that stands out to me the most in the story, is we've got to prepare ourselves for the blessing. You've got to know that it's coming. And I think we see a little bit of a testimony of the faith of this woman, because when Elisha tells her what to do, that sounds like a strange answer to her problem, doesn't it? Go gather up a bunch of jars. Go ask your neighbors, beg, borrow, whatever. Get all the empty jars that you can get. You don't have to go around doing all that. What good's that going to do? Well, when you get them gathered up, you're going to start pouring oil out of that little jar, and you're going to fill those up. Really? I mean, how many of us are going to want to step out and borrow all that and then think that? She had a bad night, did she? Elisha told her what to do. She gathered up the jars. She went behind and closed the door just like he told her. She started pouring the oil. There was a level of faith there that was a little bit different from what we saw with the widow with Elijah, and where it started off as the Lord your God, ultimately at the end of the story getting to be where she understood God was there with her as well. In this case, the woman just accepts it and moves forward. And Elisha tells her, gather the jars, not just a few. In other words, don't think that this is going to be just I'm going to split this out into a couple of jars and then somehow fool people into thinking that they're getting a bunch or whatever it is. Know that there is a big blessing coming. The amount that she trusted that was going to determine how well she prepared. If I don't think a lot's going to happen, you might have a neighbor, one of the first neighbors you go to, I ain't got any empty jars. Go away. Get discouraged. Well, it's not going to be that much anyway. I'll just go back and deal with the jars that I've got. Well, doesn't that sound like something that we do sometimes? I tried to reach out. I tried to go talk to somebody about Christ, but I got shut down on the first one, and so maybe that's just not my town. Maybe that's just not what I'm supposed to do. That's not one of the ways God's blessing me. So I'll just. She gathered a bunch of jars, enough that when Elisha talks to her at the end of it, it's go sell what you have, pay the creditors, and then have enough to live on. I don't know what olive oil prices were at the time, but apparently pretty good they are today. So she's making quite a bit out of this one jar. God's making quite a bit out of this one jar. But there's a confidence in her of what Elisha's telling her that she diligently prepares and gathers enough jars up for that. If I trust the promise that much, there's something else that I'm doing if I'm her. I'm going to start looking at the other jars that I have in the house. I'm going to look at the pickle jars. Are very many pickles still in there? Almost empty? Well, let me eat that down real quick and empty that jar so I'll have it for this that's about to happen. I don't like pickles anyway. Doesn't matter if it's full, I'll pour them out. The oil's going to be more valuable to me than the pickles. Let me evaluate what I have in these other jars, these other aspects of my life. What can I get rid of for the benefit of God being able to bless me greater through this? I want us to take that analogy over into the rest of our lives. As we think about preparing ourselves for God to provide a blessing, have we got some things in our lives that are not really benefiting us a whole lot? You bet we do. I'm not saying they have no benefit. If you like pickles, some pickles, it can be a good thing, but it may not be worth what you could have otherwise. Money's a good thing, but or can be a good thing. But if I'm so focused on all I want is money, 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 I may miss out on some other blessings that God's got for me because it's all about keeping the money jar full. And maybe I need to let go of a little bit of that so that God can bless me in this other way. Our time, our feelings towards other people. I was walking around holding on to a grudge about something or hurt. Something that it needs to be emptied out. There needs to be some forgiveness taking its place that frees us up from whatever hurt and pain and focus that is drawn in my life, so that I'm so wrapped up about that hurt, that anger, that I can't be blessed by God in these other ways. Or my jealousy. Well, I see what all they've got, and I just, kind of comes back to the money thing. I just really want all that stuff. Well, maybe that's not the right blessing in your life. So we have to begin evaluating it, and this goes back to that take stock of what you already have. What do I already have? What of it can I get rid of and free myself up, make some space for other blessings from God? Well, what of it is important, is already a blessing from God that he's trying to use to help me through this? What are the good things in my life that God can use, that he can strengthen, that he can multiply, that he can guide me through all of this and let me come out singing his praises at the other side of it? We need to evaluate everything: our thoughts, our beliefs, our attitudes, our possessions, our friendships, and much, much more, to ensure that those things are not standing in the way of God. And then fourthly, as we look at this story, we see God will fill up what we are prepared to receive. And I can't state how important that statement is. God will fill up what we are prepared to receive. You look at this story that she went about, she trusted, she went out, gathered up all these jars. We're not told a number, but enough that she's going to be able to sell it, pay the debts, and live off of it. And she's gathered all of this up. But you notice she didn't gather one jar more than what the blessing was. She didn't get to the end of the oil running out and say, man, I wish it had lasted for just one more jar. There wasn't a jar left. We understand through the story that had she had another jar, what would the oil have kept doing? It kept flowing. And if she'd have had another jar and another jar, if she could have just kept the jars coming, that oil would have continued to flow for as long as she was prepared with a place for it to go. God will fill up what we are prepared to receive. God can always do more, but he works within what we are capable of receiving, what we're capable of properly using. I've said a lot of times, God didn't bless me with a lot of money because he knows that I don't always properly use it, properly manage it. I haven't prepared myself to receive that kind of a blessing and be able to use it properly. If I spent more time working on that, he might bless me a little more in that way. Money's, I'm not all that concerned about that part of it. But we're also told in Scripture that God forgives us the way we forgive others. If I'm holding on to that grudge, how well have I prepared myself to receive the blessing of God's forgiveness? God can always pour out more on me, but he can only pour out what I've prepared myself to receive. It's the reason that one of Satan's greatest tools is getting us to believe that we're not worthy of forgiveness, or that God will never forgive me of whatever the sin is. If I can't forgive myself about it, knowing that God has that forgiveness available, how can I ever truly receive and truly enjoy the forgiveness that God has for me? I haven't prepared myself to receive it by believing that God can truly forgive it. We can go on and on and on through all of those different scenarios of things that this applies to. Excuse me. But it keeps coming back to the same statement. God will fill up what we are prepared to receive. Does that begin to change our thoughts about how to prepare? When we come to worship, how prepared are we to receive a blessing from God for being here this morning? What have we freed up? What jars have we brought to say, God, I'm ready for you to fill me up this morning with the Holy Spirit. I'm ready for you to fill me up this morning with your praise, with an understanding of how great a God you are. I'm ready for you to fill me up with some excitement about being your child and about being in your presence. Have we prepared ourselves to receive those kind of blessings being here this morning? Or have we only brought one or two little jars and not sure what we're really going to take home out of this? God can always do more. The better we prepare ourselves, the more that we spend time in his word, studying to know the things that he tells us, to know the things that are important, to know how to better evaluate the things in our lives, to know what to get rid of and what to hold on to and what jars to bring and say, God, let's work on this jar today. You know, I'm really struggling with my attitude about this situation, God. Help me to empty that jar out so you can fill it up with some happiness. So you can fill it up with some peace. So you can fill it up with a better understanding of forgiveness for me. So whatever it is, God can always do more if we'll prepare more. We'll better prepare ourselves for the other end of it to be able to use it. And a willingness that when God says, go behind the door with all the jars you gathered up and close it and begin pouring, that we gather the jars and go behind the door and we start pouring. God bless me with the knowledge of your word. If I'm not ready to take that word that he blesses me with and begin sharing it with others, how big is my jar? How much have I prepared myself for what I'm going to do with the blessing when God gives it to me? You see, one of the other things that I'm convinced of is the blessings that God wants to pour out in our lives very seldom are blessings for only us. The reality is, what he usually wants to do is, I'll bless you, but in blessing you, I'm also trying to pour some of the blessing out of those around you. And if I can get them receiving the blessing as I pour my blessing out upon them, then hopefully that's pouring back out upon you. It is the beauty of what God designed with the church, whereas each one of us becomes more in tune with God, as each one of us begins to receive more blessing. We shouldn't just be isolated in the church and I'm the only one getting the blessing. That blessing should be carrying over to those around me in the church. And from them back to me. So as we wrap this up this morning, we end up with the question, what do you have? What do you need to hold on to? What do you need to get rid of? What do you need to do to prepare? Those are questions that I encourage you to spend some time on thinking about today, this week. Maybe get out it's good exercise sometimes, get out a notepad, start writing down. Here are the things God has blessed me with this week, or this month, or my lifetime, whatever. Start a list. No matter how big or how small you think it is, here's something I think God has blessed me with. And get on the other side of that paper. Here's the things that I think are a hindrance in my life. Here are the things that I've been focused on. Here are the things that I've been worried about. Here are the things that have been stressors in my life. Begin writing those down. And then start evaluating, how do I take the blessing side and use that to counter the stressor side? And what things on that stressor list are things that in reality, I just need to say, okay, I'm just letting go of that. I've held on to it for too long. Yeah, I had somebody a long time ago that I had an issue with. Things they did that hurt, that bugged me, and I held on to it for a long time. And one day I realized, it's been about 20 years since that incident. Why am I still upset about it? I don't even see that person anymore. They're nowhere around. And yet, every time I thought about that person, for whatever reason, or something similar to that event, all of that came up, and it was like mad all over again. Why? It wasn't affecting them one bit. But it was blocking God's blessings from my life. It was one of those things I finally had to just tell myself, just let it go. It's not worth holding on to. It's not worth taking up one of my jars that God could otherwise be pouring some blessing in. Probably some other things I need to go back and make the same decision about. And I say that just because I know I'm not the only one that's in that situation. I'd almost say every single one of us has some form or fashion of those things to one degree or another. But every one of them is taking up a little bit of space that could otherwise be filled with God's blessings. So the lesson's yours with that challenge. And I encourage you, spend some time today or this week thinking about those things, making an evaluation, and then trying to see some answers that God's laying out before you. As always, we want to extend an invitation this morning because God's waiting to pour blessings out. If there's something we can do to assist you this morning in that, let us know.